Corbin, do you have a question? So let me start off. Welcome, everybody, back to our second session in our discussion of Hobbes' Leviathan, the second of two. So we're going to be wrapping it up today. Our first session talked about chapters 13 through 15. We started to get into 16, 17-ish territory. We're going to be hitting that pretty hard today. Corbin, so what's your question?
How are you doing there?
I'm doing well. Was that really your question? Or? Oh, all right. I'm doing pretty well. Yeah. I'm starting to realize I really could have used a couple more days of spring break. I don't know about you guys, but probably just as well. If I'd gotten a couple more days, I probably would have said it then too. I could have gone with a couple more days of spring break. It's never enough. How are you guys feeling about what we've covered so far regarding Hobbes? Any big standout questions? I'm going to run us through the broad strokes of 13 through 15. Whereupon, and Shai was asking this before class started, this question of how well do we have to know all 19 of those laws of nature? And the answer is not very, but 1 through 3 you should know pretty well. You should have some sense of the territory that's covered in the other 16, even if you don't remember exactly which one is which. And honestly, I don't know if you guys have figured this out about me, what kind of instructor I am, what kind of exam questions I would write. I'm not the sort of person that thinks it's impressive if you can remember all 19 of them in order. I want you to know what's the argument that Hobbes is trying to make. So what work is that doing? So let's start back here with the very first thing in chapter 13 of Hobbes' Leviathan deals with the state of nature, which is I'll grant you guys, a peculiar concept. One of the things that's so peculiar about it is I'm not really sure how literally to take Hobbes' account of the state of nature. It seems like it's a conceptual tool. Maybe it's a thought experiment. If it is intended to be a literal historical account of what humans were like before governments were formed, I'm not sure how believable it is. So maybe this is like an act of hermeneutic charity in trying to read and understand Hobbes and trying to strike up a conversation with Hobbes. I got to understand the state of nature as something maybe a little more flexible. How did we get to the state of nature, by the way? What brings this, why is the state of nature? Well, first of all, what is the state of nature like? Is it fun, footloose, fancy-free? You don't have to wear any clothes. You don't have to follow any rules. You get to stay up late. You don't have to go to philosophy class. It's awesome. Woohoo! Just a party around the clock. State of nature. No. What is the state of nature like? Sure.
Solitary, poor, nasty, brutish.
Yeah, life in the state of nature is solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. So that doesn't sound like much of a party. It sounds pretty downright gloomy. It's a war of all against all. This is the phrasing that Hobbes uses. It is warfare. And it's not even warfare with rules. It's complete chaos, complete anarchy. I mentioned Game of Thrones as a kind of maybe a placeholder in your mind for what is the sort of thing that Hobbes is talking about. Imagine an entire realm where nobody's really sure who has any authority. And really, the only authority that does exist is the authority of what you can get away with. There's no justice in the state of nature. There's no injury in the state of nature. There are rights, kinda. There are two rights. Maybe let's get into there are rights of nature according to, that sounds interesting. What are these rights of nature, Hobbes? What are these rights of nature? There are two of them.
Liberty and self-defense.
Liberty and self-defense. And liberty is not it's not the sort of right that could possibly be infringed upon. This is this interesting thing about Hobbes' rights of nature. There's no such thing as a violation of your right of nature. It is by virtue of the fact that you have a free will that you have liberty in nature. There's nothing constraining. This is the whole absence of authority thing. This is the absence of any constraint on your will. You can do whatever you feel like doing in the state of nature. That's and then with a big asterisk by that, because you can't actually do anything you feel like doing. That would be the party. The war of all against all is you can try to do whatever you feel like doing, and you will succeed at whatever you manage to pull off. And then self-defense says, one of the things that everybody is going to try to do is they're going to try to preserve their own person. Preserve their own life. And this, again, If somebody kills you, it's not like they violated that right. You are entitled to try to defend yourself. And they are entitled to try to defend themselves. And the fact that we seem to be pitted against one another, and the fact, as Hobbes kind of stipulates, that we're all roughly equal, at least in the ability to dominate one another, this means that suddenly there's this kind of spiral, there's this ramping up of aggression that only makes rational sense. Any rational agent in the state of nature will not be satisfied with just having enough to survive. Because if you do just have enough to survive, as soon as some roving band of bad actors comes your way, if you're on that knife's edge between survival and not survival, you can be pushed over the brink. So now there's motivation to not just have enough resources in order to get by or to be reasonably comfortable. You have to have more than your share. You have to have more than your share because you know that people could steal from you. And in order to have more than your share, now I need to start taking things from other people. We can see how this aggression begins to ramp up. There's an arms race that begins here, and it ends up in this territory of I'm now in a situation in the state of nature where it is in my best interest, if I am going to act freely and in my own best interest towards self-defense, then I'll even engage in preemptive strikes. If I see somebody that I distrust, and by the way, I distrust pretty much everybody. If I see somebody that I mistrust, it is reasonable in the state of nature for me to just try to kill him before I find out anything else about him. Because if you do try to find out more, if you're approach them with your hands up and say hey friend, how's it going? They could just shoot me, right? Well, no, could they just shoot me? Are there guns in the state of nature? Maybe, maybe not. They could kill me, right? They could get the jump on me. So we can see how it's not just that it's difficult to cooperate in the state of nature. It makes no sense to cooperate in the state of nature. Pearson, you had your hand up for something?
Oh, I was trying to call back to that one story we played in public about, what's his name with the ring?
Oh, yeah, Gyges. Yeah, that myth of Gyges. That's right. Yeah, so if you guys have read Republic 1, or even if you haven't read Republic 1, if you just, if you're really culturally savvy about ancient philosophy and you just heard it through word of mouth at a cocktail party or something like that. Not Republic 1, in Republic 2, Glaucon. Republic 1 kind of touches on this stuff too, because you have this figure of Thrasymachus who's saying that justice is nothing more than the will of the strongest. Right? And this kind of seems to describe the state of nature that Hobbes is describing as well. Glaucon suggests another thought experiment. After Thrasymachus has kind of been dealt with by Socrates, Glaucon suggests that, I think Thrasymachus gave up too easily. We have to consider the possibility of, this thought experiment, which is a guy who finds a ring that turns him invisible, and he uses that power of invisibility to do dirty deeds on the cheap and to, get away with it. This is an idea that's brought up in Republic 1 and 2, that when we think about injustice, we need to think about people who are good at injustice, not thieves who bungle the job and get caught, not people who try to murder other people but then get overpowered. Folks who can get away with everything. So if we can maybe imagine the state of nature as a scenario where it's not just Gyges has this ring and can get away with whatever he feels like doing, murder the king, sleep with the queen, all of those things, lie, cheat, steal. Everybody's doing it. Everybody's doing it, right, in the state of nature. It's not just Gyges, it's everyone. So this is a bad, bad state of affairs. It is to be avoided at all costs. We can think of the way that Hobbes is constructing this argument by first getting the state of nature on the table and creating it in such a way that it's such a bogey that any threat from here on out, any threat that we're going to slide back into the state of nature is just unconscionable. It's going to be the sort of thing that is to be avoided at all costs. And we'll see as we get into chapter 17 and 18 of Leviathan, he uses that to justify some pretty gnarly stuff. All right. Rights of nature. We got two of them, and they're weird. They're not like ordinary rights. And as a matter of fact, as I mentioned, there is no justice in the state of nature. So these are rights without a concept of justice, whatever that would be. And then we have these laws of nature. And again, the laws of nature don't seem to be, they're not political laws. They're not the sorts of laws that a government makes and then police come and enforce. They are rational principles that insofar as every single one of us experiences fear and desire And what was the other emotion? And hope, right? Fear and desire and hope. These three emotional triggers that kind of get me to want to get out of the state of nature and into something better. Along with those, we have rationality, and this seems to prescribe to us all sorts of rational principles that any thinking person who is interested in exercising their own free will and is interested in their own self-defense. Notice this is not predicated on some sort of love of one's neighbor or love of humanity or anything like that. It's purely self-interested, self-defense, sort of like motivated reasoning. Hobbes says every single rational agent in the state of nature will come to these same conclusions. And I mentioned that we don't need to know all 19 of them, but the first three are fairly important. Do we remember what these first three are? What's number one? Seek peace and follow it. Yeah, I like that one. Seek peace, and we get T-shirts made up. Seek peace and follow it, says Hobbes. Okay, which is to say, if the state of nature is a war of all against all, we should be trying to get out of it, right? Or we should be trying to avoid the warfare part. After seek peace and follow it, what do we have? What's the second law?
Renounce your infinite liberty.
Renounce your like. Let me hear from like everybody who thinks they have something to say. Shout it all out at once. What's the second law of nature for Hobbes? Bless you. That's not it.
Peace requires
Yeah.
Infinite liberty.
Provided that everybody else has it.
Exactly. Yeah. Okay. Actually, that was a really great illustration of what's going on in that second law. In the second law says, but I believe I picked this up from like what everybody was saying. That's a lie. I'm just going to say what I was going to say in the first place, regardless of what you guys said. Is that everybody should be willing to lay down some liberty, provided that everybody else does as well. And we can see like part of the rationale for this in what just happened, namely that like if we all try to speak at once, nobody can really be heard, right? It requires a little bit of constraint, like self-restraint, right? To say like, I'm not going to talk right here. You go first. You go first, and then I'll go, and then the next person will go, and we'll all wait so that we can hear each person, and that way each person can be heard. This is like a fairly important principle that says like we can't all just do exactly what we want whenever we want it in order for us to be able to exercise our liberty at all, because it doesn't seem like, even though I have infinite asterisks, liberty asterisks in the state of nature according to that first right, I can't really pull it off. There's like very little of what I want to do that I'm going to be able to do in the state of nature. So if I actually want to be able to do those things that I want to be able to do, which I do by definition, then I'm going to have to restrain myself. I'm going to have to lay down some of my liberty. But it only makes sense to do that on the condition that everybody else does it as well. Is that fairly clear too? That it can't be the sort of thing where like I'm gonna take a chance. I'm going to be the first one to like trust other people and lay down some of my liberty, and maybe I'll set an example and other folks will follow me and it'll be a movement. No, that seems to not be how it works, because you're setting yourself up to be exploited, to be a sucker. If you're the only one who lays down your liberty and decides to play by the rules, then you will be crushed in the state of nature. And again, this is a rational principle. What about the third law? Yeah, what about them? That's not a law. That's just 3 words. Yeah. Keep your contracts. Keep your promises. So, yeah. That third law has to do with contracts, compacts, covenants, all these sorts of things. Deals that you make, promises that you keep. And specifically, the real tricky ones that Hobbes is focused on are what he calls covenants. These are promises that you make, or deals or contracts that you make, such that one person is fulfilling that contract earlier than somebody else. You kind of make yourself vulnerable in a covenant, because the thing that you're, like the deal that you're making requires that somebody else act at a later time, and they might be able to change their mind, or they might change their mind and not fulfill the contract, and then the contract is useless. And in fact, there's no sense in making contracts if you have no reason to believe that the people that you're making contracts or compacts or covenants or promises, there's no sense of making any promises or listening to other people's promises if there's nothing to guarantee that people are going to keep them. And right off the bat, just with those 3 laws, and this is why I suggest that the first 3 laws of nature are the really important ones, we have everything that we need to kind of eject us out of the state of nature and start to get into discussions of the sovereign, the commonwealth, the Leviathan. Just to kind of, did I go through all 19 of the laws of nature at our last meeting, or did we run out of time?
Yeah, we ran out of time.
I mean, I know we run out of time every time, but here they are kind of paraphrased. So we got up through 1 through 3. Here's the rest of them. Number 4, respect those who have benefited us by relinquishing and transferring their rights, and don't make them regret it. So if somebody does right by you, if somebody offers to cooperate with you, don't make them sorry, right? Don't make them regret extending that olive branch. Don't make them regret being the sort of trusting person that's willing to make a deal with you. That actually sounds pretty good, right? Don't make people regret their movements towards peace. And this is like, we can see how this just gets it gets unpacked out of that first law. In fact, all of these laws maybe are all getting unpacked out of seek peace and follow it. Seek peace and follow it. How am I going to do that? Well, the second law says I have to be willing, in order to seek peace and follow it, I have to be willing to lay down some of my liberty on the condition that other people do too. Otherwise, we're not going to be able to seek peace and follow it. If everybody maintains this unlimited liberty, that's a liberty to go to war with one another, right? To be aggressors towards one another. So in order to seek peace and follow it, we need that second law. And in order to have the second law, covenants need to be honored. So we need the third law. And in order to have that, we have to have some principle that says don't make people regret when they make a pact with you, when they trust you, when they try to cooperate. Number 5, everyone should strive to cooperate with one another. Similar thing, right? Number 6, forgive those who repent. That sounds nice too. People will make mistakes. You can't punish them indefinitely for it. Forgive. But only those who repent, right? Not in such a way that you're opening yourself up to like this extreme vulnerability. Punishment should be rehabilitative and should be aimed at the future rather than punitive or vengeful and aimed at the past. Don't express hatred or contempt towards anyone else. Acknowledge all others as equal to oneself by nature. There's that principle again that we got at the very beginning. That's what threw us into the state of nature in the first place, was this hypothesis that everybody's roughly equal by nature. 10, no one should make a... Have I been numbering them? 10, we're almost there. No, we're not. We're about halfway there. No one should make a claim to some right that he would not extend to everyone else. This is just a reiteration of 3. 11, judges should be impartial. Anything that cannot be divided should be jointly enjoyed. That's an interesting one. If you can't divide some sort of resource up, then everybody should enjoy it together. And if that's not possible, 13, if that's not possible that everything should be jointly enjoyed or something should be jointly enjoyed, if you can't everybody enjoy it at the same time, do we all have some sense of what sorts of resources we're talking about here? Yeah, land could be, what's that? Jerusalem? Yeah, that's it. Like if we can't all enjoy it at the same time, then, and we can't, well, maybe we can divide it up. If you can't divide it up and you can't all enjoy it at the same time, then Hobbes says you got to do it in some other fair way, and the only other option here is by lottery. Is that, what do you guys think about that? Is that fair? Is random fair?
No.
Olivia?
We've been taught that since we were, well, I don't know about you guys, but I'm one of 4 children, so basically the rule in my house was share or lose it all. And then if you couldn't follow those rules, then...
What about things that can't be shared? Like half a sandwich? Like, are we going to, like, cut that up into, like, 4 equal portions? Or, like, is that how it would be how it would work?
Yeah, lottery isn't the most fair way in all
Yeah.
instances, because I know I have the worst luck of them all, but...
Do you really?
It's bad.
It's bad. Like, worse, you lose more than 1/4 of the time? Or you win less than 1/4 of the time?
I've never lost something that I didn't, or I've never won something that I didn't have to earn. Like if it's a competition in which you have to actually earn it, then I've won, but lottery cases I've never won.
Well, how many lottery cases have you been in, and with how many people?
Well, okay, I'm not going to be doing exact figure.
Yeah. I'm like being skeptical about the wrong thing. What we start off with is this fair, right? Is doing it by lottery fair. And Olivia says, like, it's not fair because I have worse luck than other people, and I'm like, I'm skeptical of that, but...
But then you might want to look at who didn't eat the most yesterday.
To each according to their need,
Right.
which doesn't get mentioned here by Hobbes. To each according to their need. That's an interesting principle. Doesn't get mentioned here. Does that seem more fair than by lottery? Well, they would claim need, but we could have some kind of neutral arbiter of who actually is in need.
And what if he wants it?
Oh, well, they have to be a neutral arbiter. They can't have it, right? And actually, didn't we mention that? Judges should be impartial. That was Law 11 was judges should be impartial. And now we're talking about lottery, right? Yeah. So yeah, maybe to each according to their need, but yeah, there's this question of who's the arbiter. Well, judges should be impartial. We already established this in Law 11. And if you can't do it by lottery, or what Hobbes ends up saying is that there's one type of lottery that sometimes doesn't seem like a lottery. It's the lottery of first come, first served. Which I don't know if that's entirely random. In fact, I would say today we have a pretty good sense that it's not random. What's that?
It would reward the ambitious.
It would reward the ambitious. It would reward the ones who want it, right? This would be how how concert tickets used to be sold, at least, was like you went and waited in line. You camped out at the box office like the night before they went on sale. If you cared enough about it to get there first, then you got the tickets. Well, if you don't want to take off your job to see the show, then I guess you didn't like the band that much. Yeah. So this is where it gets a little complicated, right? Another place where this gets complicated, if we're talking about a lottery of first come, first served, Hobbes indicates that this includes firstborn, right? Firstborn is sometimes going to be first come, and they will be first served. And so we can also think about this in terms of generational justice, if there is going to be such a thing according to these laws of nature, and there is no justice yet in Hobbes's description of things, because we're still in the state of nature. We don't have a commonwealth yet. We're not in civil society. But if there was going to be some sort of justice there, we're going to have some questions about intergenerational justice. This is a big environmental ethics problem, right? Which is does our generation have more entitlement to natural resources than future generations do? We're here first, right? May as well have at it. Take as much as you like. Future generations, they can whistle, I guess. Not my problem. Where was I? What law was that? That was actually a whole bunch of laws together. Yeah, it's 12, 13, and 14 is all of those. 15 says all who mediate peace should be afforded safe conduct. And 16, 17, 18, and 19 are all this kind of mishmash of no person being an impartial arbiter in their own concerns. This maybe addresses what Jacob was saying. What if the judge wants it for himself or herself? And we say, actually, nobody should be have any dog in the fight when they're an impartial arbiter. No person should be an arbiter for their own concerns. So what that means, by the way, is you don't get to decide whether or not some injustice has been done to you, right? Whether or not, when justice is going to come on the scene. You don't get to decide what was fair and what was not fair for yourself. Only some external agent can do that. So all judgments in cases of conflicting claims need to be referred to some sort of neutral party. Yeah, Jacob?
How practical is actually finding an impartial judge who's talking about pulling people out of the state of nature?
So yeah, these are all, they seem to be rational principles that are kind of all unpacked out of the seek peace and follow it idea that's we can maybe paraphrase. I don't know if you need to paraphrase seek peace and follow it, but if you wanted to give another account of it, it's get the fuck out of the state of nature. So I'm sorry, what was your question again?
How practical is it?
How practical is it?
Truly impartial judge.
Practical problems are going to be a second concern, right? The rational principles that are being laid out in these laws of nature are identifying that a good judge is an impartial. And what's going on in my mouth today? A good judge is an impartial judge. Yeah. Well, this is politics. There are practical problems, but it's also political philosophy. So maybe, yeah, we do have a tendency, and this is maybe not to. This isn't the best of philosophy to sometimes say those practical problems are the details that other folks can take. Political scientists can take this up. Political philosophers are doing something else. But also keep in mind, it's 1651, y'all. We're still working things out on the first draft for some of these ideas. A lot of these ideas. The state of nature idea is brand new on the block. This commonwealth and sovereignty and the Leviathan and all of that stuff, the social contract that's going to come out of this is also new idea. All right. That gets us through chapters 13, 14, and 15. And then we have chapter 16, which is about persons and authority. Did we start addressing that at our last meeting? No. Okay. Yeah? No? Well, if we're unsure, then maybe let's do it again. What's a person for Hobbes? Oh, I keep saying Hobbes. What's a person for Hobbes? Is it going to be easier if I ask you to discriminate between two kinds of persons? Because we know that he's going to do that, right? What are the two kinds of persons that he discusses? Not citizens and the sovereign, actually. Those aren't the two kinds of persons. Although citizens and the sovereign are two different kinds of persons. What are the two different kinds of persons? Artificial and natural, yeah. So we have natural persons and artificial persons. What's the difference between those? Maybe for this we need to back up. What's a person then? We might want to know, what do they have in common and what's going to make them different? What do they have in common such that they're both persons? What's different such that one of them's natural and the other one's artificial? Corbin, you got something?
Yeah, if I remember correctly, natural people have their own original ideas, and artificial people borrow ideas from other people.
That's close. Natural persons speak on behalf of their own interests. Artificial persons, maybe we've set things up well enough that we could just even guess at what an artificial person is. An artificial person speaks on the behalf of others, yeah. And there are all kinds of artificial persons. You might think of a lawyer is an artificial person, right? A lawyer speaks on behalf of their client. So they're both a natural person. When the lawyer speaks on their own behalf, they're a natural person, but they also act as an artificial person. And so in that case, what do they both have in common such that they would both be persons?
People have interest.
That they have interests, not just they have interests, that they express interests. Yeah, they speak. They kind of give voice to interests. And this is what a person is for Hobbes. Somebody who gives voice, someone or something that gives voice to interests. In fact, he even goes on a little bit of an etymological vamp on this. He does it with authority as well, to try to figure out what Hobbes is talking about with authority. You might break the word down. We'll get to that in just a second. But for person, what are the two? I don't know. I'm not even sure if this is etymologically sound. Hobbes kind of gestures us in this direction. What are the two parts of a person? You guys catch this? Was it a footnote? Was it part of the text? Where does this word person come from? Or persona? Where does that come from? I'll give you a hint. It's Latin. Personar, to give voice, right? To speak through. Hobbes indicates that it goes way back to Roman and Greek, ancient theatrical kind of dramatic masks are referred to as persona, such that you put the mask on and then you speak as if you are the character that you're portraying in the drama. And as a matter of fact, if you know anything about ancient Greek drama, do you know something about these masks? They have those tiny little megaphones in them as well, so that you can project to the rest of the amphitheater. They didn't have microphones or anything like that. So you had to speak loudly, and you had to speak as if you are some other person, and this is the mask, right? This is the persona. This is what it means to be a person, to personar, to give voice to something. Specifically in this political context, it's giving voice to interests. And natural persons speak on their own behalf, and artificial persons speak on the behalf of someone else. I mentioned lawyers, parents act and speak on behalf of their children. This makes them, at least in their role as parent, an artificial person. Yes?
What if they're speaking on behalf of themselves and someone else, like a politician?
If you're speaking on behalf of yourself and somebody else, are the interests aligned?
Yeah.
If you're speaking on behalf of yourself and somebody else because those interests are identical, then I suppose you are both at the same time.
So that's possible.
It is possible. It would require that like we be able to align our interests. And in fact, what we're going to see is like maybe we want an artificial person that can represent the interests of everybody. The whole Commonwealth, right? As if that was possible. Does everybody's interests align? Or do everybody's interests align? I can think of one way, screw that, I can think of 19 ways in which everybody's interests align. That's what those laws of nature were, right? Everybody wants to get out of the state of nature, right? Everybody's interests involve this principle that's kind of like bizarre, pessimistic version of the golden rule, which is don't do unto others what you would not have them do unto you. That's motivated out of self-interest. That's motivated out of self-defense and fear and suspicion of others, not so much out of like love and genuine care for others. We're going to get another spin on the golden rule too from Kant later on. But that could be like a fascinating lesson all on its own. Let's just go through as many different versions of what the golden rule could possibly mean. And a lot of people, I don't know about you, my sense is that a lot of people understand the golden rule in exactly the way that Hobbes is kind of conveying it here. That it's do unto others so that they'll do unto you. That's an even maybe slightly sunnier version than what Hobbes is pitching. It's about reciprocity. It's about making sure that you don't get taken advantage of, but that you're also not the sort of person that takes advantage of others. So we have natural persons and we have artificial persons. Why is it important that we have artificial persons? Because we've got to make contracts, and they have to be enforced. And the only way to enforce those contracts is if there is somebody who can speak on behalf of the interests of everybody such that we can enforce these contracts, that we can enforce these compacts, these covenants, such that we can have a commonwealth. So this whole conversation about persons, natural and artificial ones, and this conversation about authority that kind of comes out of it, we'll kind of mop that up after we get this on the board, is what gives rise to Hobbes' account of the commonwealth, which is this kind of unification of everybody's interests. And whatever is going to give voice to that unification of everybody's interests, this is the sovereign. Might call it the state as well. Hobbes also calls it the Leviathan occasionally. These are all, we can think about these things as all like the same thing, three takes on the same thing, three different takes. The Commonwealth is that kind of union of all the subjects, such that their interests are being combined into one grand unified interest, and their wills are all being combined into one grand will. That part is important. They have to combine their wills into one grand will because the sovereign needs to be strong. It needs to be more than strong. It needs to be like so strong that like nobody even thinks about going up against it. It needs to be scary. The phrase that Hobbes uses is, he says, the Leviathan awes. It awes men into compliance. It's so unbelievably terrifying that you're like, okay, I will obey. Because if it's not that, then all it takes is one warlord to come and steamroll the sovereign as well, right? And this whole Commonwealth thing falls apart. This Commonwealth, specifically the sovereign, I think the way of thinking about the sovereign, at least, is thinking about it as the artificial persona of the Commonwealth. Because, and this is maybe perhaps by definition artificial, because it's representing the wills or the interests of everybody. Right? So that's what makes it artificial. This might reside in a natural person as well, like a king, but it doesn't have to. As a matter of fact, in what unfolds in this discussion that we're about to have, note that like the very end, depending on how time goes, in chapter 19 is where we're going to get a discussion of like the relative merits of monarchy, oligarchy, and democracy. Which one does Hobbes come down on the side of? Which one does he say is best of these three? Monarchy, yeah. He says monarchy is the best, and this is perhaps not surprising because he was, after all, a royalist in the English Civil War. So my sense is that as we begin talking about the sovereign and its rights and powers and privileges and all of those things, A lot of us are going to be thinking of a tyrannical monarch. I get that. I get that, like, Hobbes opens himself up, and in fact, that might have very well been what he had in mind. Not a tyrannical monarch, but a powerful monarch is perhaps exactly what Hobbes had in mind. And in chapter 19, he actually says, of all the different ways of arranging a government, of all of the different ways of having a sovereign, monarchy seems to be the best. I get that you're going to want to resist that, and perhaps it's all right for you to resist that. I will say, however, suspend that judgment until we get an opportunity to talk about that, and also recognize that he gets through all of this before even talking about monarchy being the best kind of sovereign. So keep in mind that a democracy is a sovereignty as well. It just arranges that sovereignty in a slightly different way. So all the times that you're thinking about, like, oh, this can be abused in a tyrannical monarchy, this can be abused in a democracy as well, right? So in this conversation that we have, I would say, when you find yourself resisting what Hobbes is saying, check with yourself. See, like, am I thinking about this as a monarchy or am I thinking about it as a democracy? Try thinking about it as a democracy and see if he seems to make a little bit more sense. Because you might just disagree with him on this argument that he makes in chapter 19 and agree with all the stuff that came before it. There was a hand. It's Jack.
When he says that a monarchy is the best, is he talking about it's the kind of government that allows men to lay down a huge amount of rights, or that it's the most stable kind of commonwealth government?
It's the most stable. Well, we'll see. There are practical concerns that get into it, yeah, and that's like further down the line, and like maybe we'll get to it, and maybe we won't. And I'll be like all my cards on the table. I think it's not a great argument that he makes in chapter 19, but that's actually maybe something that's pretty cool about Hobbes, is that we can say, like, oh, just leave chapter 19 out of it and just take his arguments from 13 to 18. Perhaps like it doesn't require that I also buy into what he's arguing in chapter 19. So we'll get to that eventually. For now, I want to understand the nature of the sovereign a little bit better. Sovereign's an artificial person, we said, right? It's an artificial person. He says it's more than mere agreement. In fact, I'll put that, there's a whole quote that's fairly decent and gets at what that sovereign is all about. Or the Commonwealth, or the Leviathan, it's all the same thing. It's more than mere agreement. Or harmony. It is the real unity of them all in that they constitute a single person. So it's a very peculiar kind of artificial person. It's the artificial person that represents the interests of everybody, and not merely insofar as everybody happens to agree with one another. We're going to see that kind of idea pop up over and over and over again. This is not just democratic consensus that we're talking about. This is the actual unification of all of the interests of everybody, all of the subjects of this kind of burgeoning commonwealth in like one person, one artificial person. And that artificial person is the sovereign. We talked about this a little bit at our last meeting too, right? This is the sovereign. The sovereign is an idea. The sovereign is like the locus of authority. And when I say authority, I don't just mean like power. I mean literally authority. What are the roots that make up authority? Or what's the big root in authority? Author. Yeah. So this idea of authority, it's actually related to this kind of what's going on with artificial and natural persons. The author of one's interests are like it's where the interests actually lie, right? So if somebody is an artificial person who's representing the interests of somebody else, the author of those interests is the natural person whom they represent, and they speak on the authority of that person. And so the Commonwealth, insofar as it speaks for everybody's interests, has the biggest kind of authority that you could possibly have. It speaks for everyone. Yeah, Pearson.
So I think you answered the question. I didn't want to take it a little bit further. But I was going to ask you, how does it express everybody's interests? And you said, well, I can make 19 interests. Is that right?
Yeah, they're here. Run through.
Interests, aren't those 19 laws of nature? Those are assuming that you're thinking rationally.
Yes,
The
and
problem is there's probably a lot of people who aren't going to be thinking rationally.
that's true. That's true. And even those of us who are capable of thinking rationally, let's be honest, we don't do it all the time. And this is actually probably why we need the sovereign, why we can't be trusted to think rationally all the time. Because as soon as we stop thinking rationally, as soon as we're led by desire and passion, we'll forget about all of those rational principles that keep us out of the state of nature, and we'll start getting greedy, and we'll start getting mistrustful, and we'll start all of those behaviors that manifest themselves in the state of nature, and we won't be able to maintain civil society anymore. This is going back to the laws of nature that refer to the fact that I can't be the arbiter of justice for myself. I'm just not trustworthy because I'm not thinking rationally all the time, and because I have a dog in the fight. I have a bias there as well. So we need to somehow hypostasize all of those rational interests and put them into one person as a persona, right? One artificial person. And this ends up being the voice of everybody else's interests. And this is the ultimate authority. This is the Commonwealth. We kind of get that's the sense of this image in the frontispiece. This is the Commonwealth. This is all of the people together, and it's also the persona who commands them, right? Or who acts as the authority, acts as the source of law and the authority of law. This is the state, literally. This is the state. When Louis XIV says, just shortly after this, not too long after this, Louis XIV says, "L'État, c'est moi." I am the state. The state is me. The King of France says this. And he's like, oh, what about the state? And Louis says, I am the state. This is kind of what he's talking about. And then, granted, I can tell that the confusions that might kind of pop up between the natural person of Louis XIV and the artificial person of the King of France might make things a little bit dicey. And that's something to keep in mind. And maybe this is one of the things that leads to our misgivings about monarchy. But newsflash, democracies are going to have exactly those same problems as well. Yeah, Jacob.
So, what does Hobbes suggest actually prevents the sovereign or the state, whether it is one or many people, from acting in the same way that you as an individual would, in acting out of your own interest or acting in an illogical manner?
It's not clear that there is anything stopping us from doing that. Although one way of kind of safeguarding this is to say, as soon as we stop acting according to those unified interests of all of the subjects together, we're just not acting on their authority anymore. We lose that authority. So as soon as you stop giving voice to the interests of all, as soon as you stop doing that, as soon as you become the natural person that's only self-interested, you are not the sovereign. You lose that authority. But then we have this problem of so what is the Commonwealth now, right? If this is happening, then maybe the Commonwealth is falling apart. Maybe we are in fact sliding back into the state of nature. Anything else? Feel free vent your misgivings as well. Yeah.
So Thomas Hobbes is working the state of nature under the assumption that all human beings are inherently selfish and distrustful of one another.
That seems to be, human nature in the state of nature at least. And insofar as we ever act in any other way in civil society, it's because we've been awed into compliance by the Leviathan. Yeah.
So how could a monarch separate themselves from their own selfishness and their natural person into an artificial person if they're inherently selfish?
How does a lawyer distinguish between their interests and the interests of their client?
Law.
How does a parent negotiate between their interests and the interests of their children?
Well, I don't know how they could possibly take their own life.
It takes a little bit of effort. One way that we might be able to do it is we can try to see to it that the king has no unmet self-interest, or the sovereign has no unmet self-interest, so there's nothing that the sovereign wants for. And therefore, there's nothing that's going to motivate the sovereign to do anything but represent the unified will of everybody. This is starting to get into chapter 19 and why Hobbes thinks that monarchy is totally boss. Because he thinks actually there's less of a risk of fragmented interests, there's less of a risk of corruption and tyranny in a monarchy than there would be in a democracy. Or an oligarchy. But then again, yeah, that's later stuff. I actually am less interested in this because my sense is that you guys are less interested in this. That's not true. You guys are keenly interested in this because you want to demonstrate to me that you like democracy more than monarchy. But I don't care about what you already believe. I want to get you to think about something that you haven't thought about yet, which is like, where does the authority of the state come from in the first place? Whether it's a monarchy or an oligarchy or a democracy, it doesn't matter like who the sovereign is. The sovereign could literally be an artificial person in the sense that like it's a robot that just spits out pronouncements of like what the laws are going to be and what people have to do. A robot could also be a natural person. If it was a very sophisticated robot that could represent its own interests and speak on its own behalf. But like we could have a document that could be the sovereign. We might think that, like, and some folks talk about the United States as if this is the case, that it's the Constitution. That's where the sovereignty lies.
Doesn't the power behind the sovereign lie in whoever executes their will, though? So, like,
Well, no. That's the state of nature is like where whoever exercises their will.
No,
Like that's where justice is the advantage of the stronger, right?
right, like an actual person, like take an actual monarch or an actual group of people, an
Okay.
actual document, anything.
Right.
That doesn't have the kind of shock and awe that the Leviathan needs. So
Oh.
does that not come in there?
Well, it has to.
ability
Yeah,
to-
that's right. It has to not just be the document all by itself. It has to be the document and everything that it represents,
not
which
only
is
the body of-
this.
Right.
And the fact that, like, we could all gang, like, anybody who says, like, I ain't doing what the sovereign says, we'd be like, okay, well then, fight me, bro.
It feels against
Not just fight me, bro, like, fight me, bro. That's what the sovereign says, right? And it's got to be big and it's got to be scary. And there've got to be police and they have to have, like, big swords. Otherwise, they can't actually enforce contracts. And if you can't enforce contracts, by the way, if contracts can't be enforced, we never get any of this off the ground. We're totally in the state of nature if we can't enforce contracts. This is like the classic rejoinder to even contemporary anarchists who are going to suggest that the state of nature isn't as bad as Hobbes makes it out, and maybe they're right about that. But that kind of that lingering problem with anarchy that it always needs to respond to is like, what do we do with bad actors? On what authority do we say you're breaking the rules? On what do we even like found the trust that allows us to lay down some of our liberties such that we can all enjoy our liberty together? This is the problem, right? Oh, well, just organically. We don't need a sovereign, right? We don't need to consolidate that power into the state, into like some sort of person. But then this question is like, well, then how else are we going to enforce that? Are we all going to be arbiters of justice for ourselves? Good luck with that. All right, let's talk a little bit more about this Commonwealth /Sovereign /Leviathan. This represents the wills and interests of all. It is constituted by, one way of saying this is to say that it's constituted by the wills and interests of all. I'm going to say it a slightly different way. I'm going to say it's constituted by the social contract, which is this kind of hypothetical agreement that we all come to that we are going to unify our wills and interests and kind of place them all in the same artificial persona. So it represents the wills and interests of all. It is constituted by that social contract, which is the separate wills and interests of all coming together and being unified. And it is the embodiment of the authority to enforce contracts. Any contract, including the social contract. Every single one of us is an author of the acts of the sovereign. Whenever the sovereign acts qua sovereign, They act on the authority of every single one of us. We are all, and here I'm going to say that a slightly different way that's going to sound different, but this is the key to understanding what it is that Hobbes means by authority. We are all authors of the sovereign's actions. This is why Hobbes gets into territory where he starts saying, if you were to disagree with the sovereign, you are just not making sense. You are disagreeing with somebody who is acting on your authority. You are the author of their actions. They are only the sovereign insofar as we all authorize that sovereignty. And so as soon as we disagree with it, we are in fact disagreeing with ourselves. And this is actually the sort of problem that, we are becoming irrational, right? We're kind of falling to an irrational sort of self-interest, where I'm kind of selfish in an unsustainable way that's going to lead us all back into the state of nature. The rational self-interest is what's pushing me out of the state of nature. And insofar as, we might kind of see how this is already starting to snowball into, leaving the door wide open to tyrannical monarchies and maybe even, outright fascism. Well, first of all, I'll say, prove to me that those are necessarily bad things. I would be inclined to agree with you, but I'd be curious to hear what the reasons were. That was going someplace. Oh, right. Recognize that this is making a huge step forward out of the medieval era. Where does the authority of kind of the power of the state come from, according to Hobbes? It comes from everybody. What was the standard prior to this? The Jesus, or the big man, right? Divine right. This is as far as you can get away from. This is not divine right of rule. And that's the big step forward that all the rest of the social contract theoreticians are going to be building off of, this kind of movement away from divine right of rule and talking about an authority of the state that is guaranteed by the unified wills of all of those who are governed by the state, and also are the state. And the sovereign is the state. It's confusing, I get it, but that confusion is kind of what's making this work. Yeah.
Is everyone a part of the sovereign?
Everyone is an author of the actions of the sovereign.
Right.
And the sovereign, the power of the sovereign, the sovereignty of the sovereign, is a power that's derived from the unified wills of all of us, right? That's not quite the same as saying we're all the sovereign. Because it depends on how we arrange the sovereignty, right? If our sovereign is arranged in a democratic way, where we say, here's where the authority of the state lies, it's whatever a democratic vote says, whatever the majority in a democratic vote say, right? Then in one sense, we're all the sovereign, but we're all together the sovereign. None of us individually is the sovereign. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Sure.
What about the sovereign makes himself frightening to be synonymous with the lion?
Oh, it's got a lot of power. Yeah. It's got the capability of wielding that power in order to coerce people into compliance with the law. Even if it seems like it temporarily does not align with their self-interest, even if they're thinking to themselves this is not good for me to follow this law, we'll say yes, but if you really understood what was good for you, you'd realize that being out of the state of nature is better than anything else that we're going to get over here in any sort of commonwealth, no matter how badly managed it might be.
Isn't that kind of like communism? Or
This is all forms of government. As far as Hobbes is concerned, any form of government will follow this. So communism is one way of arranging the economic interests within a government. But that just happens to be the sort of social contract that gets made in one community. Other communities might make their social contracts in different ways and name their sovereign in a different way, kind of place the authority of sovereignty in a different sort of an artificial person. It could be lots of different things. Yes?
So if the majority of people decided to change their artificial person, change their sovereign,
I'm glad you asked that. So if the majority, yeah. If we all got together and said, we don't like this sovereign, we want to have a different sovereign, we can just change the sovereign, right? No. And here's where it starts to get weird and interesting. So do we have some sense of like what it is that the sovereign is all about? It's okay if it's a little bit confusing, because like this whole thing is built on a kind of like a very strange sort of like possibly hypothetical state of nature that like we have to get out of, but like we were never actually in it. As soon as we were human, we were already pro-social. We were already acting in communities. But maybe this is just kind of, it's this bogey, it's this specter of what awaits for us if we can't maintain some sort of authority of the rule of law, wherever that authority might lie. And we recognize that it has to be powerful and it has to be scary. It has to be the sort of thing that awes us into compliance. So we've got some sense of like what's going on there. So what are the rights and responsibilities? I might even say duties, if that makes any sense. What are the rights and responsibilities of the sovereign? That marker is no good. In fact, I'm going to avoid talking about responsibilities and duties at all. Let's just talk about the rights and privileges of the sovereign. Does anybody have the text with them? Is that actually, like, is this literally the title of chapter 18, the rights and privileges of the sovereign? Gonna make me check it myself. Number one on this list, which speaks directly to Amanda's question. What is the first right that Hobbes identifies, first right and privilege of the sovereign that he identifies? Yeah, you can't just break a promise, right? You can't break a promise. And this means that if the sovereign is created by this social, right, it is constituted by this social contract. The sovereign is constituted by the social, it's constituted by an agreement that this is where the authority of law, the authority of the state lies. This is what gets us to feel comfortable enough to lay down our liberty on the condition that everybody else will. That condition that everybody else will, like the only thing that makes that a reasonable expectation is that there's somebody that can enforce the contract, right? And so if I do make one compact or one contract and then I decide I don't want to anymore, I'm a promise breaker, right? Hobbes says you can't break the contract. You can't break the compact or contract or covenant or whatever you want to call it. You can't break the compact without the permission of the sovereign. What's the third law? Yes, this is actually another way of articulating the third law of nature. The third law of nature says, keep your promises, honor your contracts, right? This is also saying, honor your contracts. You cannot break a contract legitimately, right? You cannot break a contract unless all parties who made the contract agree to dissolve it, right?
Then you're just making a new contract and void the old contract.
So you're taking the agreement.
Well, it wouldn't be an illegitimate breaking, right? Yeah. You can't break the compact without the permission of the sovereign. We might better put this without the permission of everybody who made the compact, but who represents the interests of everybody who made the compact? The sovereign does, right? So we can see, like, if Hobbes has anything to say to weigh in on the English Civil War here and Charles I losing his head, we can see, like, this is exactly the sort of thing that he's talking about. It's like a whole bunch of people in England had a king, all got together and said, like, we don't want a king no more. But the arbiter of what counts as just, the arbiter of what the rule of law is, the persona of the sovereignty of the Commonwealth is the king. You can't just kill the king. Not legitimately, at least. You can totally kill the king. They did it, right? They cut his head off. Many kings have been killed. Many contracts have been broken. But you can't do it legitimately. You would have to ask the king, like, King, we don't think you're doing a good job. Would you mind stepping down? And the king would have to say yes. Probably the king's not going to say yes. But oh, maybe they will.
Isn't that a breach of the contract if they're then acting in their own interest instead of?
Well, we would have to know for sure that they were acting in their own interest and not in the interest of all. And we'd say, like, well, they're not acting in my interest, but like, how? Like, am I a reliable arbiter in my own cases, right? In cases where my own interest is at stake.
You need to get a third-party judge that
Need to get a third party.
in the Commonwealth at all.
Ooh, yeah, that would be interesting. But yeah, Hobbes doesn't, to my knowledge, Hobbes doesn't take it there. Rousseau gets pretty close to this too. That like you need an outsider to come help you do this. Yeah, Sarah.
So is the sovereign an artificial?
The sovereign is totally an artificial person. Yeah, it is.
Could it be both? Like,
No, it is definitely an artificial person. Like, insofar as they're the sovereign.
yeah.
The human that is king is also a natural person. But the king... Have you ever heard somebody talk about, like, you respect the office, not the person? This is the distinction that's being made, right? So, like, the natural person of King Louis XIV is not the state. Another phrase that you might have heard, respect the office or respect the rank, not the person, respect the office, not the person. You might have also heard this phrase, the king is dead, long live the king. Same thing, right? The natural person of the king has died, but the monarchy has not died, right? The office is still there, at least as long as there's some sort of like means of succession that's already been established. If there is no means of succession that's already been established, then it's anarchy, right? It's chaos. Nobody knows who the sovereign is anymore. Back into the state of nature we go. And there's civil war. Yeah.
So the king, or the sovereign always decides what is just and what is not just. So
Yeah, that's true. There is no justice without the sovereign, in fact. That would be like trying to think of like justice in the state of nature, and there just isn't any. There's just whatever anybody can get away with. The only thing that allows us to even talk about justice or something other than the state of nature, something that's going on in civil society, is the fact that there is some kind of sovereign that will enforce contracts. And we can't break that contract without that sovereign authority. Yep.
So if the sovereign is the arbiter of what's just and what is not just, doesn't that give them the power to break all of the other conditions in the social contract simply by means that they are always just?
So this is interesting, yeah. So let's stop thinking about this in terms of a tyrannical monarch for just a moment. This is what I was saying, like that's what's going to get us into trouble. Let's think about this as a democracy for just a moment. If we are living in a democracy and we decide that we're going to have a vote and we have the vote, and then the results of the vote we recognize, or you recognize at least, that like the vote didn't turn out the way that you wanted. So do you get to say like, all right, well then screw voting? No. That's the whole point of the vote, right? Yeah, you can't just like change your mind. You can't say like, democratic elections are no longer where sovereign authority lies. And just arbitrarily, like I didn't like the way that turned out. You have to kind of stick with it. Now, we might have this question of like, can a democracy decide democratically to stop being a democracy? That's an interesting question. In fact, there have like been plenty of times where like folks have argued that this is precisely what's happened. I think that some folks argue that this is more or less what happened in Iran in the late 70s. There's a group of people democratically decided to like severely weaken their democracy such that it like barely looked like a democracy anymore. Corbin?
Is a sovereign always going to be one person that is
No. A democracy and an oligarchy are sovereigns that are not one person. The sovereign is always one artificial person. It has to be. It's the unification of the interests and the wills of everybody. So it's one person, just not necessarily one natural person. It could be one natural person, but it doesn't have to be.
So it's not one human being?
Doesn't have to be. Yeah, it doesn't even have to be a human being at all. It could be a computer program.
Isn't Thomas Hobbes arguing for more of a monarchy?
Yes, he definitely wants a monarchy, but like we're not necessarily there yet. And if I hopefully I've kind of communicated this, I'm less interested in which form, which arrangement of sovereignty. At least in Hobbes, at least there's more interesting stuff to mine in the last 5 minutes of our meeting than like, is monarchy really better than democracy? I know I'm probably not going to change your mind about this. But also keep in mind that like democracies are not immune to the very things that like we're complaining about. With like, do you think there can't be a tyranny of a majority in a democracy? We had this like fab brand new democracy in the United States. How long did it take us to figure out not to enslave people? About 100 years. You thought that's bad. It took even longer to figure out that women should be allowed to vote.
Baby steps, I guess.
Yeah, sure. Baby steps. Do we think that that would be inevitable, though, right? Can you imagine a democracy where we just, like, maintain a tyranny of the majority? It's entirely possible. All you got to do is decide to make the rules such that the minority that's being oppressed doesn't get a say. All right. Can't break the compact without the permission of the sovereign. And you can't just, like, slide in a new... You can't switch sovereigns. You can't change the rules in the middle of the game. Is this, like, fair enough? What we're talking about here is, like, your ability to keep a promise. If you break a promise in order to make a new promise, who the hell is going to, like, believe that you're going to keep that promise?
But again, what if the sovereign breaches the contract?
Rights and privileges of the sovereign. Number 2, the sovereign cannot be in breach of the social contract. If we had more time, I could just like casually talk this out and we'd like pull them all out, right? As soon as you say them, I'm like, aha! Can't be in breach of the social contract. And do you know why it can't be in breach of the social contract? Wait, why? It is the social contract. It is not, and another way of saying that is, it is not a party to the social contract. The sovereign does not make the social contract. The social contract makes the sovereign. So the sovereign is not like one of the signatories of the social contract such that we can say like, you broke the deal. The sovereign didn't make the deal. The deal is what creates the sovereign.
So how does this work if the sovereign is an individual? Do they lose their individuality then?
They have to try to act as both. And by the way, like Hobbes is like there's plenty of legal argument that's going on at this time that is like squarely in this territory. Did I mention corporations are just starting to be a thing? The Dutch East India Company, which is the first corporation, was formed in 1602. So like people are there are legal debates that are going on about like the status of corporations. They are artificial persons. And there are, like, Hobbes talks about artificial persons that represent fictional interests even. We can talk about, like, an artificial person who represents the interests of a hospital or a bridge. Or a corporation, right? These are the sorts of things that are going on, but he's interested in one particular kind of, like, the artificial person that makes the Commonwealth possible, that makes anything besides the state of nature possible. You can think about like what's going on here in 1 and 2 in like a variety of ways. One is that like the sovereign is not a signatory of the social contract, and so it can't be in breach of the social contract. It is the social contract, or it's made by the social contract. You can't expect somebody who just broke a promise in order to make a new promise to keep that promise. This is like, do you guys know anybody who's ever like tried to date somebody who's already in another relationship and they're cheating on that partner? Like, don't date somebody who's cheating with their partner. They're a cheater. They're going to cheat on you. It makes no sense to believe, but they love me. Yeah, they loved like their spouse or like significant other at some point too, and then they changed their mind. And clearly they're the sort of person who wants to do that, and you're helping them do that. It makes no sense. So yeah, you can't break the social contract without the permission of the sovereign for the same reason that you shouldn't date married people. We're running out of time, so let me read through the other 12 privileges of the sovereign, and feel free to gasp as soon as it gets really hairy. So what do we got? We got 2 so far? 3, all dissenters must go along with the sovereign or else be justly destroyed. Yeah, right? And think about too, like if that sounds crazy, think about like how this might escalate. Like somebody doesn't obey the law. You're like, oh, so they can be killed. And you're like, well, maybe that's not our first option. But if they don't obey the law, and then there's some penalty for breaking the law, and we come to them, we say, like, here's the penalty, and they say, like, I ain't doing that either. I'm not complying with the penalty. So then we'll say, oh, well, so then we'll take you to jail. And they say, I'm not going to comply with that either. And they, well, then we'll take you by force. Well, I'm not going to comply with that either. Well, we'll kill you. Well, I'm not going to comply with that either. I'll kill you. Now, like, this is how you get to dissenters can be justly destroyed. Now, does this mean like any infraction warrants a death penalty? Maybe. Maybe. This depends on what the law is, actually. And we might be able to make the argument that any kind of act that undermines the authority of the sovereign threatens the entire society. Oh, it's still in there. It's still in there, yeah. But it just kind of recognizes that, like, yeah, perhaps some people can't be punished. Like, folks who are, you would have to, like, yeah, put it this way. You can only change those who want to change themselves. They would have to indicate, there was also something about, like, forgive people who repent. Like, that's, the rehabilitative punishment is only going to be possible if somebody, like, recognizes, like, I've done wrong and I need to get better. Yeah, Corbin.
Isn't the act of taking someone's life, by definition, offing whoever's life is being taken out of the social contract, because there's no covenant you can make with their death?
True, but if they are dissenting against the sovereignty of the Commonwealth, then they are already out of the social contract. They have broken the social contract. The social contract, the key to the social contract is we respect the authority of the sovereignty. That was 3. 4, it's impossible for the sovereign to act unjustly or injuriously because it is the author of justice. And we are all the author of the sovereign. The sovereign cannot be put to death or punished for any actions. The sovereign has sole judgment over what promotes or threatens peace, as well as who is allowed to speak to the masses and what they can say, and this includes books too. The sovereign has sole jurisdiction over property laws. The sovereign has sole jurisdiction over judgments that settle any disputes about the law. The sovereign has sole jurisdiction over the making of war and peace with other nations. It has the authority to appoint counselors or officers as it deems necessary. And the sovereign has the sole jurisdiction over granting titles and honorifics and like blah, 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 blah. The boring stuff that comes at the end there. And if you're thinking to yourself like, this sounds terrible, if you don't have that kind of authority in even a democracy, the democracy is worthless. There's no force of the democratic will of the majority, unless everybody respects it. That's Hobbes in a mighty big nutshell. Locke is next. He's going to give you a slightly more familiar version of this. Have a good weekend.